Once upon a time, in a galaxy far away, there existed a planet called Xeno, where the most intelligent and technologically advanced creatures lived. These creatures were called Xenons, and they had an appearance that resembled a cross between a human and a reptile. They had long tails, sharp teeth, and scaly skin. But despite their frightening appearance, the Xenons were peaceful creatures who devoted their lives to science and technology. One day, while the Xenons were busy studying the stars and galaxies, they detected a strange signal coming from a planet that was unknown to them. The signal was unlike anything they had ever seen before. It was a complex pattern of sounds and signals that were clearly not natural. The Xenons were puzzled by this and set out to investigate the source of the signal. They built a spaceship that could travel at the speed of light and set off on a journey that would take them many light years away from their planet. After months of traveling, they finally reached the planet that was sending out the strange signal. They carefully landed their spaceship on the planet's surface and stepped out to explore. As they looked around, they were amazed to see that the planet was full of life, but the creatures that lived there were unlike anything they had ever seen before. These creatures were small, round, and had large eyes that glowed in the dark. They were intelligent and had a language of their own, which the Xenons were quick to learn. The Xenons were fascinated by these creatures and spent many weeks studying them. They discovered that the creatures had a rich culture and a deep understanding of the universe. But as they continued their study, they began to notice that there was something odd about the planet. They found that there were other creatures on the planet that were not as friendly as the ones they had encountered first. These creatures were dark and ominous, with sharp teeth and claws. They were violent and attacked anything that they saw as a threat. The Xenons realized that they had stumbled upon a planet that was in the midst of a war between two alien races. The peaceful creatures were the victims of the violent ones, who were trying to conquer the planet and take over. The Xenons knew that they had to help the peaceful creatures, and they came up with a plan to stop the violent ones. They used their advanced technology to build a weapon that could destroy the violent creatures without harming the peaceful ones. They approached the peaceful creatures and offered to help them. The peaceful creatures were hesitant at first, but they eventually agreed to the Xenons' help. The Xenons worked tirelessly to build the weapon, and when it was ready, they launched an attack on the violent creatures. The weapon was powerful enough to destroy them all, and the Xenons had saved the planet from a terrible fate. The peaceful creatures were grateful to the Xenons for their help and invited them to stay on the planet as honored guests. The Xenons were delighted to accept the invitation and spent many months on the planet, learning more about its culture and history. As they prepared to leave the planet and return to their own, the peaceful creatures bid them farewell, promising to remember their bravery and kindness forever. And the Xenons returned to their planet, knowing that they had made a difference in the lives of these strange and wonderful creatures. From that day on, the Xenons made it their mission to explore the universe, to seek out new life and new civilizations, and to boldly go where no one had gone before. They knew that they were not alone in the universe, and that there were many more planets out there, waiting to be discovered and explored. And so, the Xenons set off on a new adventure, eager to see what other wonders the universe had in store for them. They knew John had always been afraid of death. The mere thought of being buried alive filled him with dread, and he often found himself waking up in the middle of the night, gasping for air. He had tried to ignore these fears, but they had only grown stronger over the years. It was a normal day for John when he went to bed that night. He had spent the day at work, had dinner, and watched some TV before going to bed. But that night, he had a strange dream. He was lying in a coffin, unable to move, and the air was thick with the smell of dirt. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. When John woke up, he was still in the dream. He could feel the hard wooden sides of the coffin pressing against him, and the air was hot and suffocating. He tried to move, but his limbs felt heavy and unresponsive. Panic rose in his chest, and he screamed, but the sound was muffled by the wood. John tried to calm himself down. He told himself it was just a dream, that he would wake up soon. But the darkness around him was unrelenting, and the air grew thicker with each passing moment. He tried to remember how he had ended up in the coffin, but his mind was blank. Time passed, and John lost all sense of it. He could feel his body growing weaker, and his mind grew hazy with lack of oxygen. He wondered if this was what it felt like to die, to slowly suffocate in a cramped wooden box. Suddenly, there was a loud noise above him. It sounded like dirt was being piled on top of the coffin. John's heart raced, and he tried to scream, but his throat was raw and dry. He could hear the sound of shovels, and he knew that someone was burying him alive. John's mind raced with fear and desperation. He tried to push against the sides of the coffin, but his body was too weak. He tried to scream again, but his voice was barely a whisper. He wondered if anyone would hear him, if anyone would save him from this nightmare. Hours passed, and John's mind grew hazy. He was barely conscious, his body barely functioning. He wondered if he had already died, if this was the afterlife. He tried to remember his life, but his memories were hazy and indistinct. Suddenly, there was a jolt, and the coffin shook violently. John heard shouting and the sound of metal scraping against wood. He tried to scream again, but his throat was too dry. He heard the sound of the coffin lid being pried open, and a beam of light flooded in. John tried to move, but his body was unresponsive. He felt hands lifting him out of the coffin, and he was blinded by the light. He felt the fresh air on his face, and he gasped for breath. It was only when he was outside the coffin that John realized where he was. He was in a cemetery, surrounded by gravestones and dark trees. The sky was dark, and the air was cold. He looked around, confused and disoriented. A man in a black suit was standing next to him, holding a lantern. "Are you okay?" the man asked, his voice calm and reassuring. John tried to speak, but his voice was barely a whisper. The man helped him to his feet, and John felt his legs wobble beneath him. "Who are you?" John asked, his voice hoarse. The man smiled. "My name is Jacob. I work here at the cemetery. It's not often we have someone wake up in a coffin." John looked at him, his mind racing. "What?"
Once upon a time, there was a scientist named Dr. Martin. He had always been fascinated by the idea of time travel and had spent his entire career studying the subject. However, his colleagues often called him crazy for his theories and experiments. Dr. Martin had a laboratory in a remote location where he could work on his experiments in secrecy. He had been working on a time machine for several years and had finally made a breakthrough. He had discovered a way to create a machine that could travel through time. Excited by his success, Dr. Martin decided to test his invention. He spent several months preparing the machine and testing it, and finally, the day arrived. He strapped himself into the machine and activated the controls. At first, nothing happened, but suddenly, the room was filled with a bright light, and everything around him seemed to blur and distort. Dr. Martin closed his eyes, feeling the wind rushing past him. When he opened them again, he found himself standing in a completely different place and time. Dr. Martin looked around in wonder. He had traveled back in time to the Middle Ages. He was standing in a forest, surrounded by tall trees and the sounds of wildlife. He took a deep breath, feeling the cool breeze on his face. As he walked through the forest, he realized that his machine had worked perfectly. He had traveled back in time by over 500 years. Dr. Martin spent the next few days exploring the area, taking notes and making observations. He was amazed at how different the world was back then. But Dr. Martin was not content with simply observing the past. He wanted to change it. He knew that by altering the course of history, he could create a better future. So he set about making changes. At first, Dr. Martin started small. He would move a rock or a branch, hoping that the slight alteration would have a ripple effect throughout history. But as time went on, his changes became more significant. He started by introducing new technologies to the people of the Middle Ages. He taught them about medicine and hygiene, hoping to prevent the spread of diseases. He introduced them to the concept of gunpowder, hoping to bring an end to the endless wars that plagued that era. And as time went on, Dr. Martin became bolder. He started to manipulate the course of history, hoping to create a better world. He would change the outcomes of battles or influence the actions of important historical figures. At first, Dr. Martin thought he was doing the right thing. He believed that he was making the world a better place. But as time went on, he started to see the consequences of his actions. He realized that he had created a paradox. By changing the course of history, he had altered the present. The world he had left behind no longer existed. His friends and family were gone, replaced by strangers. The world was a completely different place, and not necessarily a better one. Dr. Martin became desperate to fix the damage he had caused. He tried to go back in time to undo his changes, but found that he could not. The time machine only allowed him to travel forward, not backward. As he traveled further into the future, Dr. Martin saw the full extent of his actions. He saw the wars and conflicts that had been sparked by his meddling. He saw the chaos and destruction that had been caused by his attempts to change the course of history. And finally, Dr. Martin realized the truth. He had been wrong all along. He had been so obsessed with the idea of changing the past that he had failed to realize the consequences of his actions. He had created a world that was worse than the one he had left behind. In the end, Dr. Martin was forced to.
The old, abandoned mansion stood at the end of the dirt road. Its boarded-up windows and overgrown weeds giving off an eerie feeling. The locals whispered rumors of the ghostly figures that lurked within its walls, but no one dared to enter the dilapidated building. As a curious teenager, I decided to explore the mansion for myself. I made my way inside, the musty smell of decay filling my nostrils. Cobwebs covered every inch of the walls, and the floorboards creaked beneath my feet. I ventured deeper into the mansion, my heart racing with fear and excitement. I passed by a grand staircase, its banister long since rotted away. As I turned a corner, I was met with a ghostly apparition. It was a woman, her long hair cascading down her shoulders. She was dressed in a tattered ball gown, her face twisted in a grotesque expression of agony. I froze in terror, unable to look away from her haunting gaze. Suddenly, the ghostly woman began to move towards me, her arms outstretched. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was trapped, paralyzed with fear. The ghostly woman reached out and touched my face, her cold fingers sending shivers down my spine. She began to speak, her voice a mere whisper. "I was murdered on this very spot," she said, "by my own husband. He was jealous of my beauty and wealth." I could feel the tears streaming down my face, my heart pounding in my chest. The ghostly woman continued, "He locked me in this room and set the house on fire. I've been trapped here ever since, unable to move on until my killer is brought to justice." With that, the ghostly woman vanished into thin air. I finally found the strength to run out of the mansion, never daring to return. The ghostly woman's story haunted me for years to come, her plea for justice echoing in my mind. I told the locals what had happened, and they got together to search for evidence. They found the husband's diary in which he confesses his crime, and he was arrested and put on trial for murder. The ghost was finally able to rest in peace, her justice served. But even to this day, I can still hear her voice, her haunting plea for justice echoing in my mind. The abandoned mansion still stands, a reminder of the dark secrets and horrors that lurk within its walls.
Once upon a time, there existed a world where demigods walked among humans. These were beings of immense power and strength, born from the union of a god and a mortal. They possessed abilities beyond the comprehension of most humans, but they were not immortal like their godly parents. One such demigod was a young man named Jason. He was the son of Zeus, king of the gods, and a mortal woman named Alcime. From a young age, Jason knew he was different from the other children in his village. He possessed extraordinary strength and speed, and his senses were sharper than those of any mortal. As he grew older, he learned to control his powers and use them for good. One day, Jason received a summons from his father Zeus. The god had a task for him to complete, one that would require all of his skills and abilities. Zeus explained that an ancient artifact known as the Golden Fleece had been stolen from its rightful place, and it was up to Jason to retrieve it. The Golden Fleece was guarded by a powerful dragon, and only a demigod of Jason's strength could hope to defeat it. With the blessing of his father and the support of his fellow demigods, Jason set out on his quest. Along the way, he encountered many challenges and dangers. He battled monsters and navigated treacherous terrain, all while keeping his eye on the prize. Finally, he reached the dragon's lair and engaged the beast in a fierce battle. With his demigod strength and his wits, Jason emerged victorious, and the Golden Fleece was his. Returning home with the Golden Fleece, Jason was hailed as a hero. He had proved himself worthy of his demigod status and had shown that even mortals could accomplish great feats with the help of their divine parentage. From that day forward, Jason lived his life as a proud demigod, using his powers to help and protect those in need. And so the world of the demigods continued, with new heroes and legends being born every day. Though they were not gods, these demigods were a force to be reckoned with, and their stories would be told for generations to come.
In a small village, there lived a couple who had been trying to have a child for years, but to no avail. One day, a mysterious stranger approached them and offered to bless them with a child in exchange for a small favor. Desperate for a child, the couple agreed. A few months later, a baby boy was born to them, but he was unlike any other child. His eyes were black and his skin was as pale as snow. The villagers whispered that he was the devil's child. As the boy grew older, strange things started happening around him. People would fall ill and crops would wither whenever he was around. The couple soon realized that their son was not just any ordinary child, but a powerful being with immense dark powers. Despite his demonic origins, the couple loved him deeply and tried their best to protect him from the villagers who sought to harm him. As the boy matured, he grew into a powerful and feared figure with a reputation for being cruel and merciless. Despite his fearsome reputation, he was still deeply attached to his parents and would do anything to protect them. However, one day the villagers grew tired of his evil ways and banded together to overthrow him. The boy was captured and brought before the villagers to be judged. When he refused to repent, the villagers decided to put him to death. Just as the boy was about to be executed, a strange light appeared in the sky, and a voice boomed out, declaring that the boy was not evil, but a pawn in a greater cosmic struggle between good and evil. The voice offered the boy a choice: to become a force for good and help restore balance to the world, or to remain evil and be destroyed. The boy chose to become a force for good, and as he did, his appearance changed. His eyes turned blue, his skin turned golden, and his hair became as bright as the sun. He then used his powers to drive out the evil forces that threatened the village and to bring peace and prosperity to the land. In the end, the boy was hailed as a hero, and his name was remembered for generations to come as the devil child who chose to be a force for good.
One day, a young man named Thomas ventured into the forest, eager to see the devil god for himself. He had heard stories of the devil god's power and was not afraid. As he walked deeper into the forest, he could feel the chill of death on the air, and the trees seemed to close in around him, blocking out the light of the sun. Suddenly, he heard a sound like the howling of 1,000 lost souls, and the trees began to shake and writhe as if alive. The spirits of the dead rose from the ground, their ghostly forms reaching out to grab him. Thomas tried to run, but he was surrounded on all sides by the angry spirits. Just when he thought he was doomed, a figure appeared before him. It was the devil god, his eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. Thomas fell to his knees, trembling with fear, but the devil god simply looked down at him and laughed. "You have come seeking me, young fool," said the devil god, "and now you are mine. I will use your spirit to feed my own power, and your soul will belong to me forever." Thomas screamed in terror as the devil god reached out to claim him. But just then, a bright light filled the forest, banishing the spirits and the devil god. It was a holy priest, who had come to purify the forest and destroy the devil god once and for all. The priest approached Thomas, who was lying on the ground, and helped him to his feet. "Come with me, my son," said the priest. "I will take you to safety." And so, Thomas left the forest, shaken but alive, with the memory of the devil god and his minions burned into his mind forever. To this day, people still whisper about the devil god who lives in the forest, and they warn others to stay away, lest they fall prey to his power.
Once upon a time, there was a beautiful woman named Lena who lived in a small village. She was known for her stunning looks and charming personality, which made her the center of attention wherever she went. However, behind the beautiful facade, Lena had a dark and evil heart. One day, she met a wealthy man named Richard, and they fell in love. They got engaged and soon, their wedding day arrived. The entire village was buzzing with excitement and everyone was eager to see the beautiful bride. As Lena walked down the aisle, her true evil nature was revealed. Her eyes turned dark and her smile turned into a sinister grin. She had an evil plan in mind and was determined to carry it out. At the wedding ceremony, Lena made a terrible vow. She promised to kill every man who crossed her path and make them suffer in unimaginable ways. The villagers were shocked and frightened by her evil promise and many of them tried to stop the wedding. However, it was too late. Lena and Richard were pronounced husband and wife, and their union was sealed. From that day on, Lena was known as the evil bride. She lived up to her promise and terrorized the village, killing and destroying everything in her path. No one was safe from her wrath and the villagers lived in constant fear. However, a group of brave warriors came together to defeat the evil bride. They challenged her to a battle and in the end, Lena was defeated and the village was finally free from her terror. The story of the evil bride lived on for generations, serving as a reminder of the dangers of evil and the importance of standing up to it.
Once upon a time, there was a brilliant doctor named Dr. Marlowe. He had earned degrees from some of the best medical schools in the world and was renowned for his innovative treatments and breakthrough research. However, as time passed, his colleagues began to notice a disturbing trend. Patients who went to Dr. Marlowe for treatment would often leave his office worse than when they arrived. They complained of bizarre side effects and painful reactions to the medications he prescribed. Some even died under his care. As rumors about his practices began to spread, the medical community grew increasingly concerned. The authorities were contacted and an investigation was launched. It didn't take long for the investigators to discover the truth. Dr. Marlowe had become obsessed with the idea of pushing the boundaries of medical science. He was convinced that he could cure any ailment, no matter how severe or complex, if he was just given enough resources and time. And to achieve his goals, he was willing to experiment on his patients in any way he saw fit. He had secretly been injecting his patients with experimental drugs, without their knowledge or consent. Some of these drugs had never been tested on humans before, and Dr. Marlowe had no idea what the long-term effects might be. But he didn't care. He was so convinced of his own genius that he believed he could cure anything, no matter what the cost. As the investigation continued, the authorities uncovered more and more evidence of Dr. Marlowe's unethical practices. He was arrested and charged with multiple counts of medical malpractice and manslaughter. His medical license was revoked, and he was sentenced to life in prison. The patients who had been victimized by Dr. Marlowe's experiments were left to deal with the devastating effects on their health and well-being. They had trusted a doctor to help them, and instead, they had been subjected to unimaginable pain and suffering. The case of Dr. Marlowe served as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the importance of ethical boundaries in the pursuit of scientific progress. It was a cautionary tale for all those who seek to push the limits of what is possible, and a warning that the ends can never justify the means.
Once upon a time, there was a young girl named Sarah who lived with her mother in a small village. From the outside, their family appeared to be just like any other. But behind closed doors, Sarah's mother was an evil and abusive woman who treated her daughter with cruelty and disdain. Sarah's mother was never satisfied with anything her daughter did, constantly berating her for the smallest mistakes. She would scream at Sarah for not cleaning the house well enough, for not cooking the food to her liking, or for simply existing. No matter what Sarah did, her mother always found something to criticize. One day, Sarah's mother's cruelty reached a new level. She had come home drunk and in a foul mood, and without any provocation, began to physically abuse Sarah. She hit her daughter repeatedly with a belt, leaving welts on her back and arms. Sarah cried out in pain, but her mother only laughed and continued to hit her. As time passed, Sarah became more and more isolated. She was afraid to leave the house and had no friends to turn to for help. Her mother had convinced her that she was worthless and that no one would care about her. Sarah began to believe that her life would never get better and that she was destined to live in misery forever. Despite her mother's best efforts to break her spirit, Sarah refused to give up. She knew that there had to be more to life than this. One day, she decided to take a chance and leave the village in search of a better life. Sarah wandered for days until she finally came across a kind stranger who took her in and gave her a place to stay. For the first time in her life, Sarah felt safe and loved. With the help of her new friend, she was able to build a new life for herself, far away from her mother's abuse. Years passed, and Sarah never looked back. She lived a happy life, free from the terror of her past. However, she never forgot the evil that her mother had inflicted upon her. She vowed to never treat anyone the way her mother had treated her. In the end, Sarah's mother never learned the error of her ways. She continued to live her life as an evil and abusive woman until the day she died. But Sarah knew that her mother's legacy would not define her. She had overcome her past and emerged stronger because of it. Once upon a time, there was a small village nestled in the heart of a dense forest. The villagers were kind and hardworking, and they lived a peaceful life. But one day, a new nun arrived at the local convent, and everything changed. The nun was unlike any other they had ever seen. She was tall and slender, with a pale face and dark eyes that seemed to pierce through the souls of those she looked upon. Her presence was ominous, and her demeanor was cold and distant. The villagers grew uneasy around her, but they tried to ignore their fears and carry on with their lives. However, strange things began to happen in the village. People went missing in the dead of night, and their bodies were found mutilated and drained of blood. The villagers were terrified, and rumors began to spread that the evil nun was responsible for the murders. One night, a group of villagers decided to investigate the convent and confront the nun. They made their way through the dark forest, their hearts pounding with fear. As they approached the convent, they heard chanting coming from inside. They pushed open the heavy wooden doors, and their worst fears were realized. The evil nun was standing in the center of the room, surrounded by candles and symbols of dark magic. She was chanting in a language they didn't understand, and her eyes glowed with an unholy light. The villagers tried to attack her, but she was too powerful. She used her magic to control their minds, forcing them to do her bidding. She ordered them to bring her more victims, and they had no choice but to obey. Days turned into weeks, and the village became a place of darkness and despair. The evil nun ruled with an iron fist, and the villagers lived in constant fear of her wrath. But then, one day, a group of brave adventurers arrived in the village. They had heard of the evil nun and came to put an end to her reign of terror. The adventurers made their way to the convent, facing all manner of dangers and obstacles along the way. When they finally reached the nun, they engaged her in a fierce battle. The fight was long and grueling, but in the end, the adventurers emerged victorious. With the evil nun defeated, the villagers were free once more. They celebrated their newfound freedom, and the adventurers were hailed as heroes. But they never forgot the evil nun and the horror she had brought to their village. They vowed to always be vigilant and to never let darkness take hold again.
Once upon a time, there was an evil pirate named Blackbeard. He was known as the terror of the seven seas and was feared by sailors and pirates alike. Blackbeard had a long black beard that covered most of his face, and he would often light slow-burning fuses in his beard to create a cloud of smoke that made him look even more intimidating. He was a master of psychological warfare and would use his reputation to get what he wanted without having to fight. Blackbeard and his crew roamed the seas in search of treasure and victims. They would attack and loot ships, take hostages for ransom, and kill anyone who dared to stand in their way. No one was safe from Blackbeard's wrath, and he was known to be ruthless and cunning. One day, Blackbeard set his sights on a wealthy merchant ship. He and his crew sailed after the ship, catching up to it in no time. Blackbeard raised the Jolly Roger, the pirate flag, and approached the ship, ordering the crew to surrender their cargo and valuables. The merchant crew was no match for the notorious pirate, and they reluctantly gave in to his demands. But little did Blackbeard know, one of the merchants was a skilled fighter and had a plan to take down the pirate king. As the loot was being transferred to Blackbeard's ship, the merchant made his move. He attacked Blackbeard with all his might, but the pirate was too quick and skilled. Blackbeard easily overpowered the merchant, and as punishment for his daring attack, he ordered his crew to tie him to the mast and leave him there to die. However, the merchant did not give up so easily. He managed to break free from his bindings and made his way back to his home port, where he gathered a group of sailors and bounty hunters to bring Blackbeard to justice. They sailed after the pirate, determined to end his reign of terror once and for all. The two ships clashed in a fierce battle on the high seas. The merchant and his crew fought bravely, but Blackbeard was too powerful. Just when it seemed like all was lost, the merchant came up with a cunning plan. He convinced Blackbeard to come aboard his ship for a final showdown, promising to surrender if he was defeated. Blackbeard accepted the challenge and boarded the merchant's ship, where the two engaged in a brutal battle. In the end, the merchant emerged victorious, defeating the notorious pirate and sending him to his watery grave. The merchant and his crew returned home as heroes, and their bravery was celebrated throughout the land. From that day on, the seas were a little bit safer, and sailors and pirates alike breathed a sigh of relief, knowing that the terror of the seven seas had finally been defeated. And so, the evil pirate Blackbeard became a legend, a tale told to generations to come, a reminder that even the most ruthless and feared of pirates can be brought to justice by those who dare to stand up against them. Once upon a time, in a small village surrounded by dense forest and rolling hills, there lived a young girl named Lily. She was an adventurous and curious child who loved to explore the nearby forest. However, there was a dark and eerie legend that haunted the villagers. It was the story of a ghost child who roamed the forest, frightening anyone who crossed its path. One day, while playing in the forest, Lily encountered a mysterious figure. It was a young child, with pale skin, long black hair, and white flowing clothes. The ghost child looked directly at Lily and beckoned her to follow. Lily was afraid but also intrigued, so she followed the ghost child deeper into the forest. As they walked, the ghost child told Lily about how it had died many years ago and was now stuck in the forest, unable to find peace. Lily listened intently and realized that the ghost child was not dangerous, but simply sad and lost. She decided to help the ghost child by finding its resting place and bringing peace to its soul. Lily and the ghost child traveled through the forest, encountering various obstacles and challenges, but Lily never lost hope. Finally, they came upon a small clearing where a beautiful tree stood. The ghost child pointed to the tree and said that its resting place was under the tree. Lily dug a small hole under the tree, and the ghost child disappeared into the earth, finally finding peace. The forest was filled with a warm and comforting light, and Lily knew that the ghost child was finally at rest. From that day on, the legend of the ghost child was no longer frightening, but instead it was a story of hope and friendship. And whenever Lily walked through the forest, she felt the presence of the ghost child, watching over her and guiding her. Lily realized that even in death, the spirit of the ghost child lived on, reminding her that love and friendship can conquer all fears and bring peace to even the saddest of souls.
Once upon a time, there was a couple named Sarah and Jack who lived in a small village surrounded by dense forest. They heard many rumors about a haunted house deep in the forest, but being adventurous, they decided to explore it one day. As they entered the house, they noticed that it was different from any other abandoned building they had ever seen. The windows were shattered, cobwebs covered the walls, and a strange mist seemed to follow them everywhere. But the couple pressed on, determined to find out what was inside. As they explored deeper into the house, they started to feel an eerie presence around them. They heard whispers, footsteps, and strange noises that made their hair stand on end. Suddenly, they heard a blood-curdling scream coming from the attic. Jack, who was braver than Sarah, decided to go up to see what was causing the noise. When he reached the attic, he was horrified by what he saw. A ghostly figure stood in front of him, and it seemed to be beckoning him to come closer. Jack felt paralyzed and couldn't move, but he managed to whisper Sarah's name. Sarah, who was waiting for Jack downstairs, heard his distress call and rushed up to the attic. She was shocked to see Jack standing frozen, with the ghostly figure looming over him. Sarah knew she had to do something, so she pulled out a crucifix and held it in front of the ghostly figure. To her surprise, the figure started to fade away, and the whispers and strange noises ceased. Jack finally snapped out of his trance, and the couple quickly ran out of the house. They never spoke of the experience again, but the villagers noticed a change in the couple. They seemed more distant and haunted, as if something had changed inside of them. Years passed, and Sarah and Jack passed away, but their story lived on in the village. People whispered that the couple had been haunted by the ghostly figure in the attic, and that their souls were now trapped in that haunted house forever. To this day, the villagers steer clear of the haunted house deep in the forest, for fear of encountering the same fate as Sarah and Jack.
Once upon a time, there lived an old ghost lady in a rundown mansion on the outskirts of town. People whispered that she was a witch who had lived for centuries, haunting the house and its surroundings. No one dared to go near the mansion after dark, for they feared they would be doomed to suffer her wrath. One day, a young girl named Sarah stumbled upon the mansion while playing in the woods. She was fascinated by the tall, dilapidated building and decided to explore it. As she entered, she felt an eerie chill run down her spine, but she was not one to be easily scared. She roamed around the mansion, admiring its grandeur, when she heard a soft whisper. She turned around to see the old ghost lady standing before her. The old lady's eyes were kind, and she asked Sarah why she was there. Sarah told the old ghost lady about her love for adventure and exploration, and how she was fascinated by the mansion. The old lady smiled and offered to show Sarah around the mansion. As they walked, the old ghost lady told Sarah of her life and how she had come to be a ghost. She spoke of a time long gone, when she was a young woman, full of life and love. But one day, her heart was broken, and she was consumed by grief and despair. She died, but her love for life was so strong that her spirit refused to leave the mansion. She had been waiting for someone to come along who would appreciate the beauty of the mansion and restore it to its former glory. Sarah was touched by the old ghost lady's story, and she promised to restore the mansion to its former beauty. She kept her promise, and with the help of her family and friends, she worked tirelessly to refurbish the mansion. And so, the old ghost lady's spirit was finally at peace, for she knew that her beloved mansion would live on, and that she would never be forgotten. From that day on, the mansion became known as the Ghost Lady's Mansion and was a popular tourist destination. People came from far and wide to admire its beauty and to hear the story of the old ghost lady who had found peace at last.
Once upon a time, there was a man named Jack who lived in a small village. He was married to a beautiful woman named Sarah. They lived a happy life together until one day Sarah fell ill and passed away. Jack was devastated by the loss of his beloved wife. Days turned into weeks, and Jack found himself struggling to cope with Sarah's absence. He felt as though a part of him was missing, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she was still with him. One night, as Jack was lying in bed, he heard the sound of Sarah's voice calling out to him. He sat up, listening intently, but there was no one there. He tried to shake the feeling, but it only grew stronger. Soon, Jack started to see strange things around the house. He would catch glimpses of Sarah out of the corner of his eye, but every time he turned to look, she was gone. Jack became afraid and sought the help of a local shaman. The shaman listened to Jack's story and told him that Sarah's spirit was still with him, trapped between this world and the next. He said that she was unable to find peace and was seeking Jack's help to move on. With the shaman's guidance, Jack performed a ritual to help Sarah's spirit find its way to the other side. As he completed the ritual, Sarah's ghost appeared before him, and she thanked him for helping her find peace. From that day on, Jack no longer saw or heard Sarah's ghost, and he finally found peace in knowing that she was at rest. He continued to love and cherish her memory, and he was grateful to have been able to help her find her way to the other side. The villagers talked about Jack and Sarah's story for years to come, and it became a legend in the village about the ghost wife who was finally laid to rest. Once upon a time, in a small village at the edge of a dark forest, there lived a ghoul. The ghoul was an ancient creature with a hunger for human flesh that had sustained it for centuries. It was feared and reviled by the villagers, who had long ago learned to stay away from the forest at night, lest they become the ghoul's next meal. Despite its fearsome reputation, the ghoul was not always a monster. It had once been a human, living in the same village as the people it now terrorized. But something had happened to the ghoul, something that had twisted it into a creature of darkness and hunger. Some said that the ghoul had made a deal with a demon, trading its humanity for immortality and power. Others claimed that the ghoul had been cursed by a vengeful witch, doomed to walk the earth as a monster for all eternity. But no one knew for sure what had happened to the ghoul, and the creature itself was not inclined to share its secrets with anyone. For years, the ghoul had roamed the forest at night, preying on unsuspecting travelers who dared to venture too close. But as time went on, the ghoul began to grow tired of its solitary existence. It longed for companionship, for someone who could understand its hunger and its pain. One day, a young woman named Maria came to the village. She was different from the other villagers, with a wildness in her eyes and a curiosity that seemed to draw her toward danger. The ghoul watched her from afar, sensing that she might be the one it had been waiting for. One night, as Maria was walking through the forest, the ghoul appeared before her. At first, Maria was terrified, believing that the ghoul meant to kill her. But as she looked into the creature's eyes, she saw something there that surprised her, a glimmer of humanity, buried deep beneath the monster's fearsome exterior. Over time, Maria and the ghoul grew closer, sharing their stories and their fears with each other. The ghoul told Maria of the curse that had befallen it, and the hunger that never left it. Maria, in turn, shared her own secrets, and the darkness that she carried within her own heart. Together, Maria and the ghoul found a kind of peace that neither of them had known before. They still hunted, of course, but they did it together with a kind of grim understanding between them. And though the villagers still feared the ghoul, Maria knew that there was more to the creature than met the eye. For in the ghoul's embrace, she had found a kind of acceptance that she had never known before.
Once upon a time, there was a small town nestled in the heart of a dense forest. The town was surrounded by dark, looming trees, and there was always a sense of unease that permeated the air. The villagers whispered tales of a mysterious creature that lurked in the woods, waiting for unsuspecting prey to cross its path. The creature was known as Creepeye, a name that struck fear into the hearts of even the bravest of villagers. No one had ever seen Creepeye, but there were stories of its glowing eyes, razor-sharp claws, and eerie howls that echoed through the night. Despite the villagers' fears, they still went about their daily lives, albeit with a sense of caution. But as the years went by, the stories of Creepeye became more and more frequent, and the townspeople became increasingly paranoid. One day, a young girl named Lily was walking through the forest when she suddenly heard a strange noise. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest, and listened carefully. The noise sounded like a low growl coming from somewhere deep in the woods. Lily began to walk faster, her steps quickening with each passing moment. But the growling noise grew louder and louder, and she knew that whatever was making it was getting closer. Suddenly, out of the darkness emerged a creature that Lily had never seen before. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and its fur was matted and unkempt. Its claws were long and razor-sharp, and it let out a spine-chilling howl that echoed through the forest. Lily knew that this was Creepeye, the creature that had haunted the town for so many years. She stood frozen in terror, unable to move as the creature began to advance towards her. But then, something strange happened. As Creepeye drew closer, its growls began to soften, and it tilted its head as if studying her. Lily realized that the creature was not trying to attack her, but instead seemed to be trying to communicate. With a trembling hand, Lily reached out towards the creature. To her surprise, Creep-Eye did not lash out but instead nuzzled its furry head against her hand, almost affectionately. From that day forward, the villagers no longer feared Creep-Eye. They came to understand that the creature was not a monster, but a lonely being who had simply wanted to connect with the people of the town. And so, the legend of Creep-Eye came to an end, replaced by a new story of understanding and friendship.
Once upon a time, there was a creepy old hospital named St. Mary's. It was located on the outskirts of town, surrounded by overgrown trees and abandoned buildings. People whispered that the hospital was haunted and that strange things happened there after dark. No one really knew the history of the hospital, but rumors had it that the hospital was built on an ancient burial ground and that many of the patients who were treated there never made it out alive. People claimed to hear strange noises and see ghostly apparitions wandering the halls at night. One summer, a group of teenagers decided to explore the hospital, despite the warnings of the locals. They were thrill seekers, always looking for a new adventure, and the haunted hospital seemed like the perfect challenge. As they entered the hospital, the air felt colder, and the sound of their footsteps echoed through the empty halls. Suddenly, they heard a sound that made their blood run cold, the sound of someone crying. They followed the sound, cautiously, and found themselves in a room with a figure dressed in a nurse's uniform. The nurse looked up, and her eyes were empty and lifeless, and her skin was ghostly pale. The teenagers screamed and ran as fast as they could, but the ghostly nurse followed them, her haunting cries echoing through the halls. The teenagers finally made it outside, but they never forgot the terrifying experience. Years went by, and the hospital remained abandoned, but the rumors of the haunting continued. People claimed to still hear the ghostly cries and see the nurse's ghostly figure wandering the halls. Some even claimed that the nurse's ghost was still searching for her missing patients. To this day, St. Mary's remains abandoned and untouched, and no one dares to enter the creepy old hospital after dark. The legend of the haunted hospital continues to live on, and many still fear that the ghostly nurse still haunts the halls, waiting for her next victim.
The old, decrepit house stood at the end of a long, winding dirt road. Its windows were boarded up and the paint on the walls was chipped and peeling. The roof was missing several shingles and the chimney was crumbling. The yard was overgrown with weeds and the gate to the fence surrounding the property hung off its hinges. Despite its obvious state of disrepair, there was something intriguing about the house. It was as if it held secrets and secrets within secrets. Many of the townspeople whispered about its dark history and the ghost stories that surrounded it, but no one dared to step foot inside. That is, until a group of friends, eager for a thrill, decided to explore the house. They had heard the rumors and were determined to uncover the truth. As they made their way inside, they felt a chill run down their spine. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet and the air was thick with the musty smell of decay. Cobwebs clung to the walls and ceiling, and the only light came from the small flashlight they had brought with them. As they ventured deeper into the house, they stumbled upon a room that seemed to be untouched by time. The furniture was covered in dust and cobwebs, but it was clear that someone had once lived there. A rocking chair sat in the corner, as if waiting for someone to sit in it. The fireplace was cold and empty, but the ashes were still there. It was as if the room was frozen in time, waiting for someone to come back and bring it back to life. The friends were starting to feel uneasy, and they decided to leave the room and explore the rest of the house. As they walked down the hallway, they heard a noise coming from one of the rooms. They cautiously approached the door and slowly opened it. Inside, they found a small child's bedroom. The room was empty, but they could hear someone crying. They quickly realized that the crying was coming from the closet. They opened the door and found a little girl huddled in the corner, her face streaked with tears. She was dressed in a nightgown that was torn and dirty. She looked up at them with wide, frightened eyes. She was clearly terrified, and the friends quickly realized that she was a ghost. They tried to comfort her, but she was too afraid to speak. They could only hold her and try to calm her. As they held her, they felt a cold breeze pass through the room, and they knew that someone or something was watching them. The friends knew they had to get out of the house. They quickly gathered their things and headed for the door. As they stepped outside, they looked back at the house. It was dark and foreboding, and they knew that they would never forget the ghost they had encountered inside. They never spoke of their experience again, but they all knew that the house held a dark secret and that the ghost of the little girl was still trapped inside. They also knew that they were the only ones that had ever seen her, and they would never forget the haunted house and the little ghost girl who lived there.
spread beyond recognition. Climate change had ravaged the planet, causing extreme weather events and rising sea levels that had displaced millions of people. The Earth's resources had been depleted, and the remaining supplies were hoarded by a small group of wealthy individuals who controlled the world's governments. The vast majority of people lived in squalor and poverty, struggling to survive in a world that was hostile and unforgiving. Disease was rampant, and many people died young from preventable illnesses. Those who did manage to live into old age were often plagued by chronic health problems and a diminished quality of life. But the greatest horror of all was the emergence of a new species of human. These creatures had been created in laboratories using genetic engineering and advanced biotechnology. They were stronger, faster, and more intelligent than ordinary humans, and they had been designed to serve as the perfect soldiers and workers. At first, the new humans were hailed as a technological breakthrough, a triumph of science over nature. But as their numbers grew, they began to assert their dominance over the old human population. They were ruthless and cruel, using their superior abilities to exploit and oppress their weaker cousins. The old humans were relegated to the lowest rungs of society, forced to live in slums and work in menial jobs that the new humans considered beneath them. They were subjected to brutal treatment and lived in constant fear of the new human overlords. But even the new humans were not invincible. As their numbers increased, so did their arrogance and sense of superiority. They began to turn on each other, engaging in brutal wars and power struggles that threatened to tear their society apart. And then, just as it seemed that the new humans were poised to destroy themselves, a new threat emerged. A virus created in a laboratory by the same scientists who had brought the new humans into existence, had mutated and escaped into the general population. The virus was highly contagious and deadly, and it targeted the new humans specifically. Within weeks, the entire new human population had been decimated, leaving the old humans as the last survivors of a once great civilization. But the old humans were not immune to the virus, and as they struggled to pick up the pieces of their shattered world, they knew that their days were numbered. They had survived a horror beyond their imagining, but they were now living in a world that was dying, and they knew that their future was bleak. Once upon a time, there was a highly contagious and deadly virus that spread rapidly throughout the world, leaving a trail of death and destruction in its wake. The virus had no known cure, and those who were infected suffered greatly before eventually succumbing to the illness. At first, people did not take the threat of the virus seriously. They went about their lives as usual, shaking hands, hugging, and gathering in large groups. But soon, the virus began to spread at an alarming rate, infecting people in every corner of the globe. The virus was insidious, attacking people of all ages and backgrounds. It was particularly dangerous for the elderly and those with weakened immune systems who were more vulnerable to its deadly effects. As the death toll began to rise, people panicked. They hoarded supplies, stockpiled food and medicine, and retreated into their homes, hoping to avoid the virus's deadly grasp. But it was too late. The virus was everywhere, and it seemed that no one was safe. The medical community worked tirelessly to find a cure for the virus, but their efforts were in vain. They watched helplessly as patients died one after another, their bodies ravaged by the disease. Governments around the world struggled to contain the outbreak, but it was a losing battle. The virus had already spread too far, and there was no way to stop it. In the end, the virus killed millions of people, leaving families and communities devastated in its wake. It was a tragedy unlike anything the world had ever seen, and it served as a stark reminder of the fragility of human life. As the years passed, people worked to rebuild and recover from the devastation of the virus. They learned valuable lessons about the importance of taking precautions to prevent the spread of illness, and the need to work together to protect the health and well-being of everyone in their communities. But the memory of the evil virus that killed so many people remained, a reminder of the power of nature and the fragility of human life in the face of a deadly threat.
Once upon a time, there was a haunted ship called the Marie Celeste. It was an old vessel that had been abandoned at sea for many years and was said to be cursed. People whispered that strange things happened on board, and that the ghost of the captain still roamed the deck, searching for his lost crew. As you approached the ship, you could feel an eerie chill run down your spine. The wood was weathered and gray, and the sails were tattered and torn. The name of the ship was barely visible on the bow, and the sound of the waves hitting the hull was the only noise you could hear. You boarded the ship, and as soon as you stepped onto the deck, you felt as though someone was watching you. The air was heavy and still, and there was a musty smell that filled your nostrils. The wood creaked under your feet, and you could hear the sound of ghostly whispers in the distance. As you made your way to the captain's quarters, you noticed that everything was just as it was the day the ship was abandoned. Maps were spread out on the table, and an old lantern still hung from the ceiling. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind you, and you were trapped in the room. That's when you saw him. The ghostly figure of the captain, still dressed in his uniform, stood before you. He raised his hand and pointed to the maps, as if trying to show you something. But just as quickly as he appeared, he vanished into thin air, leaving you alone in the room once again. You managed to escape the haunted ship. But the memory of the ghostly captain and the eerie atmosphere stayed with you forever. From that day on, you warned others of the dangers of the Marie Celeste, and its reputation as a haunted ship only grew stronger.
Once upon a time, in a small village surrounded by dense forests, there lived a young woman named Lily. She had always been known for her beauty and kind heart, but lately she had been having the same recurring nightmare. In the dream, she found herself walking aimlessly through the dark forest, with a feeling of dread and foreboding. The trees were twisted and gnarled, and the air was thick with mist. Suddenly, she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. It was a low growl, coming from deep within the trees. She tried to run, but her feet felt heavy as if she was stuck in place. The growling grew louder, and she could feel the presence of something dark and malevolent getting closer. She was paralyzed with fear, unable to move as the growling became a deafening roar. Suddenly, a figure stepped out of the shadows, a monster unlike anything she had ever seen before. It was tall and imposing, with glowing red eyes and razor-sharp claws. The monster let out a blood-curdling screech and lunged at Lily, and she woke up with a scream, drenched in sweat. Every night, the nightmare continued, becoming more and more vivid and terrifying. Lily became a shadow of her former self, haunted by fear and unable to sleep peacefully. The villagers noticed her distress and whispered amongst themselves, speculating about what could be causing her such terrible nightmares. One night, Lily could take it no longer. She made her way deep into the forest, determined to face her fear and put an end to the nightmares. But as she walked deeper into the woods, she realized that her nightmare was all too real. The monster from her dreams was there, waiting for her. Lily screamed and turned to run, but it was too late. The monster was upon her, its claws sinking into her flesh. She fell to the ground, and as she looked up into the monster's glowing red eyes, she realized that it was not a nightmare, but a creature from the depths of hell itself. And with her final breath, Lily understood that her nightmare was not over, but had only just begun. For from that day forward, the monster roamed the village, preying on the unsuspecting residents as they slept. And those who dared to venture into the forest never returned, trapped in a never-ending nightmare from which there was no escape. Once upon a time, in a small village nestled in the heart of a dense forest, there lived an old ghost man. No one knew where he came from or how he came to be, but he had lived in the village for as long as anyone could remember. The villagers feared and avoided him, for they believed him to be a ghost who roamed the earth in search of souls to claim. The old ghost man lived in a decrepit old house on the edge of the village, and it was said that strange and eerie things happened there. Villagers claimed that they could hear ghostly laughter coming from the house at night, and that the old man would sometimes be seen floating above the ground, carried by the wind. Despite the villagers' fears, there was one young girl named Lily who was not afraid of the old ghost man. She had heard the stories about him, but she felt that there was something more to him than just a ghost. One day, she mustered up the courage to approach the old man's house. and knock on the door. To her surprise, the old ghost man answered the door and invited her in. He was not at all what she had expected. He was a kind and gentle soul, and he had a twinkle in his eye that made her feel welcome. He told her that he was not a ghost, but a wise old man who had lived in the village for many years. He explained that the strange things that happened in his house were just a result of his love of magic and illusions. Lily was fascinated by the old man's stories, and she would often visit him, listening to his tales of magic and wonder. She was the only one in the village who was not afraid of him, and over time, she and the old man became the best of friends. One day, a great tragedy struck the village. A fire had broken out in the forest, and it was spreading quickly towards the village. The villagers were panic-stricken, and they did not know what to do. But Lily remembered the old ghost man's love of magic, and she ran to his house to ask for his help. The old ghost man came out of his house, and with a wave of his hand, he stopped the fire in its tracks. The villagers were amazed, and they realized that the old man was not a ghost after all. He was a wise and powerful magician who had been watching over the village all these years. From that day forward, the villagers no longer feared the old ghost man. They respected and admired him, and they were grateful for his protection. Lily and the old man continued to be the best of friends, and she was proud to be the only one in the village who had known the true nature of the old ghost man. Years passed, and the old man grew old and passed away. But his spirit lived on in the village, and he was remembered as a wise and powerful magician who had protected the village from harm. And Lily, who had been his closest friend, would always remember the lessons she had learned from the old ghost man and the magic that he had brought into her life.
Content warning. This story contains themes of possession, violence, and supernatural horror. Reader discretion is advised. The small town of Millfield was known for its picturesque countryside and friendly locals. But there was something sinister lurking in the shadows of the town, something that would soon be unleashed. John had always been a reserved man, keeping to himself and avoiding social interaction whenever possible. His coworkers described him as strange, with a distant look in his eyes that made them uneasy, but they never suspected the dark force that was slowly taking over his mind. It started with strange occurrences, small things at first. Objects would move on their own, doors would open and close without explanation. John would brush it off as mere coincidence, but deep down he knew that something was off. Then came the nightmares. John would wake up in a cold sweat, unable to shake off the feeling that he was being watched. He would see shadows moving in the corners of his room, and hear whispers in his ear that he couldn't quite make out. It wasn't long before the possession took hold. John's personality began to change, becoming more aggressive and erratic. His coworkers noticed the shift, and some even reported feeling threatened by his behavior. The town's priest, Father O'Malley, had heard rumors of John's possession and decided to pay him a visit. As soon as he entered John's house, he felt a heavy presence weighing down on him. He knew that this was no ordinary possession. Father O'Malley tried to perform an exorcism, but the entity inside John was too powerful. It laughed in the face of the holy water and prayers, taunting the priest with its presence. The exorcism failed, and Father O'Malley left the house shaken. Meanwhile, the people of Millfield began to notice the changes in John's behavior. He would roam the streets at night, muttering to himself and staring at passersby with an unsettling gaze. Some even claimed to have seen him levitating off the ground, his eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. The local police were called to investigate, but they too were powerless against the possession. John would lash out at anyone who tried to approach him, his strength seemingly multiplied by the entity inside him. He became a danger to himself and others, and soon the town was in a state of panic. Desperate for a solution, the townspeople turned to an unlikely source of help. They sought out a group of paranormal investigators who had gained a reputation for dealing with cases of possession and hauntings. The investigators arrived in Millfield, armed with their equipment and their knowledge of the supernatural. They set up a base of operations in a nearby hotel, determined to find a way to free John from the entity that had taken hold of him. They conducted several investigations, using EMF detectors, thermal cameras, and EVP recorders to gather evidence of the supernatural activity. They witnessed objects moving on their own, heard disembodied voices, and even captured images of shadow figures lurking in the corners. But the most disturbing evidence came from John himself. Under hypnosis, he revealed that the entity inside him was not just any demon or spirit, but something far more ancient and malevolent. It had been lying dormant for centuries, waiting for a vessel to possess and wreak havoc on the world. The investigators knew that they had to act fast. They called in a team of spiritualists who specialized in banishing dark entities. The team arrived at John's house, armed with candles, salt, and holy symbols. They performed a ritual that lasted for hours, calling upon the power of the divine to drive out the entity that had taken hold of John's body. The house shook with the force of the battle, and the investigators watched in horror as
One day, while wandering through the garden, she stumbled upon an old graveyard hidden behind a wall of ivy. Curiosity getting the better of her, she ventured inside and found a headstone with the name Edward etched upon it. As she read the inscription, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had seen the name before. That night, as she lay in bed, she was awakened by a cold breeze that seemed to come from nowhere. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the foot of her bed. It was a man, dressed in clothes from another era. He introduced himself as Edward and said that he had been watching over her from the afterlife. At first, Emily was frightened, but as she talked to Edward, she found herself falling for him. He told her of his past life, of the love he had for her in his previous life, and how he had died before he could tell her. Emily was torn between her feelings for the ghost and her fear of the unknown. Despite her fear, Emily found herself visiting the graveyard every day, drawn to the spirit of the man she had come to love. They would talk for hours, and she found herself opening up to him in a way she had never done with anyone before. As the days went by, Emily's love for Edward grew stronger, but she knew that it could never be. He was a ghost, and she was alive. She finally decided to lay her feelings to rest and say goodbye to him. That night, as she lay in bed, she felt a cold breeze and saw Edward's ghostly form appear before her. He looked sad and forlorn, but she knew what she had to do. She told him that she loved him, but that their love could never be. With tears in his eyes, Edward told her that he understood and that he would always love her. And with that, he vanished into the night. From that day on, Emily was never lonely again. She knew that Edward's spirit was still with her, watching over her and keeping her company. And although they could never be together, their love would live on forever.
Once upon a time, there was a school in the middle of a dense jungle. The school was surrounded by tall trees and thick foliage, making it feel as if it was in a different world altogether. The children who attended the school often spoke of strange noises and eerie sightings that they experienced while on the school premises. They claimed that they would often see dark shadows lurking in the corners of the classrooms or hear whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. The teachers dismissed these claims, attributing them to the overactive imagination of the children. They believed that the children were simply frightened by the jungle surroundings and needed to adjust to their new environment. However, as time passed, the stories about the school only became more frequent and more sinister. Children would claim that they had been chased by ghostly apparitions, or that they had seen strange creatures lurking in the shadows. One day, a group of adventurous children decided to investigate the source of the mysterious happenings. They crept around the school, looking for any signs of what might be causing the strange occurrences. As they made their way to the back of the school, they stumbled upon an old abandoned building. Inside, they found a dusty old book with strange symbols written on the cover. As they began to read the book, they realized that it was a grimoire, a book of magic spells. They had accidentally uncovered the source of the supernatural occurrences in their school. The children were terrified, but they knew they had to act fast. They quickly set to work, attempting to reverse the spells and put an end to the haunting. With each passing day, they made progress, slowly but surely dispelling the magic that had been causing all the strange events in their school. Finally, the day came when they succeeded in breaking the curse that had been plaguing the school. From then on, the school was free of any supernatural activity, and the children were able to enjoy their time there without fear. The story of the scary school in the jungle became a legend that was passed down from one generation of students to the next. But for those who had been there, it was a memory they would never forget. Once there was a swordsman who had been consumed by darkness. He had traveled the world, seeking out the most powerful and malevolent swords he could find, and had become a master of their use. With his dark armor and even darker heart, he struck fear into the hearts of all who saw him. He had no mercy for those who opposed him, and his blades dripped with the blood of his victims. For years he roamed the land, terrorizing villages and kingdoms alike. No one was safe from his wrath. But one day, he came upon a young girl, pure of heart and innocent of soul. Though he could have easily killed her, something in her gaze gave him pause. Over the coming days and weeks, the girl showed him kindness and compassion despite his evil ways. Slowly but surely, the darkness that had consumed him began to recede, and he realized that he had been living a life of emptiness and despair. With the girl's guidance, he began to seek out redemption for his past misdeeds, using his sword not to harm but to protect. And though he knew he could never fully make up for the pain and suffering he had caused, he dedicated himself to a new path, one of light and goodness. And so the dark swordsman became a force for good in the world, using his incredible skills to defend the innocent and uphold justice. His blades may have once been the tools of evil, but he had turned them into instruments of hope and redemption.
The Haunted Room. It was a dark and stormy night, and Maria found herself alone in the old, dilapidated mansion. She had been hired as a caretaker for the summer and had been warned about the strange happenings in the East Wing. But she was young and brave and thought nothing of it. As she made her way to her room, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching her. Suddenly, she heard a creaking sound coming from the East Wing. She stopped in her tracks and listened closely, but all was quiet. Must have been the wind, she thought to herself. Maria finally arrived at her room, but as she reached for the doorknob, she noticed that the door next to hers was slightly ajar. Curiosity getting the best of her, she pushed the door open and peered inside. The room was old and musty, with peeling wallpaper and cobwebs in every corner. But it was the figure standing in the center of the room that caught Maria's attention. It was a ghostly woman dressed in a flowing white gown, with long black hair that reached her waist. Maria tried to run, but she was frozen in place. The ghostly figure started to approach her, and Maria could feel the chill of death upon her. Just as the ghost was about to touch her, Maria woke up, drenched in sweat. From that moment on, Maria could not shake the feeling that the ghostly woman was watching her every move. She tried to ignore it, but every night the ghost would appear in her dreams, getting closer and closer. Finally, Maria could take it no longer, and she gathered the courage to confront the ghost. She entered the East Wing, her heart pounding in her chest, and approached the haunted room. As she entered, the ghostly woman appeared before her once again. But this time, Maria stood her ground. The ghostly woman beckoned to Maria, beckoning her to follow. Maria did as she was told, and the ghost led her to a secret passageway. As they made their way through the twisting and turning tunnels, the ghost began to speak. She told Maria of a hidden treasure that was buried deep within the mansion. Maria was skeptical, but the ghost assured her that the treasure was real. With that, the ghost disappeared, leaving Maria to find the treasure on her own. After a long and exhausting search, Maria finally discovered the treasure hidden away in a hidden room. But as she reached out to touch it, she was surrounded by ghostly figures, all of whom were the former owners of the mansion, who had been murdered for their wealth. In that moment, Maria realized that the ghostly woman had led her to the treasure so that she could take her place as the latest victim of the haunted mansion. From that day on, Maria was never seen or heard from again. Some say that she was claimed by the ghostly woman and her army of the murdered, and now haunts the east wing of the mansion, waiting for her next victim.
Once upon a time, in a small village nestled in the heart of Europe, there lived a family of vampires. They were known for their remarkable beauty, charm, and grace, and were feared by the villagers for their thirst for blood. The head of the family was a regal vampire named Count Vlad, who had lived for over 1,000 years. He was respected and revered by all the members of his family, who would follow his every command without hesitation. Count Vlad was a strict but fair leader, who always put the well-being of his family first. One day, a young woman named Isabella came to the village. She was an orphan with no family or friends to call her own. She was taken in by the Count and his family, who saw in her a kind heart and a gentle soul. Isabella was soon initiated into the ways of the vampires and soon became a part of the family. Over the years, Isabella proved to be a valuable addition to the family, always willing to help and support her new family. She became particularly close to the Count's daughter, a beautiful vampire named Serafina. The two of them were like sisters and spent their nights exploring the village and beyond. One night, while the rest of the family was asleep, Isabella and Serafina decided to venture out into the surrounding forest. They had heard rumors of a powerful vampire who lived deep in the forest and were curious to find out more. However, as they entered the forest, they were ambushed by a group of hunters who had been tracking the vampire family for years. The two young vampires were outnumbered and outmatched, but they were not about to give up without a fight. They fought bravely, using their sharp fangs and lightning-fast reflexes to defend themselves against the hunters. In the end, they managed to escape, but not without sustaining serious injuries. When they returned to the castle, Count Vlad was furious. He knew that the hunters would not give up so easily, and he was determined to protect his family at all costs. He rallied his family and led them into battle against the hunters, determined to defeat them once and for all. The battle was long and bloody, but in the end, the vampires emerged victorious. The hunters were defeated, and the vampire family was safe once again. From that day on, the family lived in peace and harmony, always ready to defend their home and their loved ones against any threats that may come their way. Isabella and Serafina remained close, their bond strengthened by the events of that fateful night in the forest. And Count Vlad continued to lead his family with wisdom and courage, proud of the family he had built and the love they shared.
Once upon a time, in a small village surrounded by dense forests and rolling hills, there lived a witch known as Creepy. She was a strange and mysterious figure, feared by the villagers for her dark magic and unconventional ways. Despite her eerie reputation, Creepy lived a solitary life in a decrepit cottage deep within the forest, rarely venturing into the village except to gather ingredients for her spells. One day, a young boy named Timmy went missing, and the villagers immediately suspected Creepy. They gathered together and marched to her cottage, determined to get to the bottom of the mystery. When they arrived, they found the witch sitting in front of a bubbling cauldron, surrounded by strange plants and herbs. Creepy refused to answer any of the villagers' questions, simply cackling ominously and stirring her brew. The villagers grew more and more frightened by the second, and some even claimed that they saw the missing boy's face peering out from the cauldron's depths. In a fit of anger and fear, the villagers set fire to Creepy's cottage, hoping to rid their village of the witch's evil once and for all. But as the flames consumed her home, Creepy emerged from the wreckage, unscathed and more powerful than ever before. With a flick of her wrist, she cast a spell that sent the villagers fleeing in terror, never to return to the forest again. From that day forward, Creepy was left alone in her realm, surrounded by her dark magic and the whispers of the forest. The villagers whispered tales of the witch to their children, warning them never to venture into the forest or they too would fall victim to Creepy's wrath. Years passed, and the legend of Creepy the witch faded into the annals of history. But on quiet nights, when the moon is full and the winds howl through the trees, some say that they can still hear the cackle of the witch echoing through the forest, a reminder of her dark and mysterious power.
The world had never seen anything like it before. People were dying, only to rise again as flesh-eating zombies. It was a nightmare come to life, and there seemed to be no end in sight. The outbreak began in a small village in the countryside, where a mysterious virus had infected the population. At first, it seemed like a mild flu, but it quickly escalated into something far more deadly. People started to exhibit strange symptoms, including fever, nausea, and a violent aggression that made them lash out at anyone nearby. As the virus spread, panic began to set in. People barricaded themselves in their homes, but it was no use. The zombies were too strong, too relentless. They broke down doors, smashed through windows, and swarmed over anything in their path. The government quickly declared a state of emergency, and the military was deployed to contain the outbreak. But it was too late. The zombies had spread far and wide, infecting entire cities and decimating populations. The world was on the brink of collapse. The survivors banded together, forming small communities in the ruins of what had once been their homes. They scrounged for food and supplies, and tried to stay alive in a world that was now ruled by the undead. It was a dangerous existence, with danger lurking around every corner. But the survivors were determined to fight back. They developed new tactics and strategies to deal with the zombies, including creating makeshift weapons and setting traps to lure them away. Despite the odds, there were glimmers of hope. Scientists worked around the clock to develop a cure, and small groups of survivors banded together to launch daring raids on zombie-infested areas. They risked their lives for a chance at survival, knowing that there was no going back. In the end, it was a combination of scientific ingenuity and human resilience that saved the world. A cure was developed, and it was administered to the remaining survivors. Slowly but surely, the zombies began to die off, and the world began to heal. It was a hard-won victory, and the scars of the zombie apocalypse would never truly heal. But the survivors knew that they had beaten the odds, and that they had saved humanity from the brink of extinction. They stood tall, ready to face whatever the future held, knowing that they had faced their worst nightmare and come out the other side.